What is going on, everybody, and welcome back to another Trans Am episode. So today we're going to be working on the air conditioning. Now, I ran into quite a few problems with this, so I had to split this video up into two parts. So today we're going to be fixing the air conditioning, getting some good temperatures out of the vents, and then in part two, which is already recorded, I just have to edit it, we're going to be actually doing some cooling system mods, doing some stuff to the fans, the radiator, hoses, thermostat, temperature switch, stuff like that, just trying to get the AC to work a little better and get the car to run a little bit cooler. But with that being said, let's pull this thing inside and I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. Now, all the components in the AC system on this car are original as far as I can tell. You can see it still has the original hoses coming off the accumulator. The condenser is still the original tube and fin type, which doesn't work too well with newer refrigerants. And the evaporator looks like it has never been touched. It still has the foam still sticking out of the casing. Then as for the cherry on top, yeah, that's the original R4 compressor from 1986. Now, before we start pulling anything apart, we want to make sure the system is empty of refrigerant. You can easily do this by just pulling the cap off one of the Schrader ports, stick a little screwdriver in there, press the little kind of tire valve down, and if you hear any kind of hissing or if there's any pressure behind that valve, the system still has refrigerant in it and you're going to have to get that evacuated. In my case there, you can see there's absolutely no pressure in the system. It probably leaked out years ago. So next step, we're just going to make sure the compressor isn't seized up. You can see I was able to turn the clutch there a little bit, so that's not sticking. Now I'm just going to pull the connector off. We're going to hit this with power and ground with the power probe, and you'll be able to see the clutch moving in and out, so we know that the compressor clutch is actually working, and hopefully the rest of the compressor is good as well. But before we start pulling everything apart, this is everything we're going to be using today. So I have 3 cans of refrigerant. We are doing a R134A conversion on this thing. I also have a can of Ester oil as well as a bottle of Flush. For the retrofit, we're going to be using these fittings I got from AutoZone. These are just going to screw onto the stock fittings that are on the car and allow us to hook up our R134A hoses. I'm also going to be using a vacuum pump as well as a set of gauges to vacuum the system down and make sure there aren't any major leaks. In addition to that stuff, we also have these little can fittings that actually screw onto the cans of refrigerant, allowing us to hook them up to our gauges and actually get the refrigerant into the system. We're also going to be installing a blue Ford orifice tube. This is just going to work better with the R134A opposed to the white one that's in there that worked with the older R12. In addition to that, we are going to be installing a new accumulator. I just didn't have it on hand by the time I actually started recording this. But finally getting started here, we're going to start with that orifice tube. We want to remove this so we'll be able to flush the entire system without that being a restriction. So we're going to come in here under the accumulator, remove the nut for this hard line, then we can separate it and get in there with a pair of needle nose and pull the thing right out. And looking at this, it really isn't in bad shape. You want to really look to see if this is clogged up. There are a few shavings on here, being as old as the car is and the compressor. This looks really good though. It isn't clogged up, and once we charge it up, it should still work. But now we're just going to put the line back on minus the orifice tube. As I mentioned, we want to leave this open so we can get the flush completely through the system and not have that orifice tube in the way. So next step is going to be to come in here, remove the connector from the low pressure sensor on the accumulator, and then remove the 2 nuts attaching the accumulator to both the AC hoses and the evaporator itself. With the accumulator removed, I'm just going to come in here with a 3/4 inch heater hose, slip it over the top port on the evaporator, and this is going to give us a spot to funnel in our flush it through the evaporator, through where the orifice tube was, into the condenser, and then out the top port on the condenser before it goes to the compressor. You don't want to put flush through the compressor, so just make sure that's disconnected from the rest of the system before you start pouring it in. So we got the flush poured in. I have a bottle on the other end of the condenser where all of the flush is going to be collected, and then I put a paper towel with a zip tie on the top just to keep the fumes down. Now I initially gave this way too much air pressure at the first go ahead. You can see that hose just blew the hell right off. I popped it back on and took it a little bit slower, and look at all of the flush nicely coming out into the bottle. Know that I have both of the hoses going to the compressor disconnected, so that's the one going out the top of the condenser as well as the one going into the accumulator. but I ran almost a full quart of flush through this thing, and it was actually coming out pretty clean. It's not dark or metallic. That would indicate a problem with the compressor, and as you guys saw, the orifice tube, there was nothing significant inside of there. So naturally, I had a feeling that the compressor was going to be fine. I had a feeling. But I was pretty happy with the amount of flush I got through this. And look at how clean this came out. It's not gray, it's not metallic, there are no chunks in it. Now just something to keep in mind, this flush procedure only applies to old cars. You can't flush a newer style system just because the condenser is a parallel flow style with smaller orifices, and it's just not going to be able to flush. This style is an old tube and fin type, which is literally just like a tube running all the way down to the bottom with a bunch of fins on it. So it's one clear shot, you can easily flush it out. It doesn't have little tiny pinholes inside of it. So after finishing most of the flushing, I came over to the hoses by the compressor. I decided to flush them out as well, but then I came across this giant hole right in the hose going across the top of the radiator. Luckily, the closest auto parts store was actually able to get this for me the same day. I picked it up the next day just because I had to go to work, but we got a nice replacement set of hoses. I popped them right in with some new O-rings, didn't have to flush them being they were new. Then we were ready to install the accumulator, orifice tube, tidy up the lines a little bit, and then finally screw on our conversion valves. So with all of our hoses back together, we are ready to come in here and vacuum down the system. So I hooked the valves up to the conversion fittings, opened them up. Now we're just going to flip on the vacuum pump and let this thing do its thing. Our goal here is to make sure there are no major leaks and to remove all the moisture from the system. That's going to allow the refrigerant to work better, and also make sure that we don't have some major leak where we go to put refrigerant in the thing and it just all comes spraying out. So our goal here is to open up these valves, let this thing sit under vacuum, and we're going to look at this needle when we come back, and we want this to be sitting right around 30 inches. That's going to tell us we don't have any big leaks and we're ready to go ahead and charge the system up. So I let this sit for about 45 minutes, and looking at the gauge, we are nowhere near 30 inches. This indicates that we do have a leak somewhere in the system, whether it's an O-ring or the condenser, compressor. I really think the culprit is going to be the compressor here, because looking at this, you can see there's kind of oil around the compressor, and there's a clear indication that at one time this was leaking. But really the only fix for these compressors is to either buy a new one or rebuild the one you have. Definitely don't bother going to a junkyard, don't bother getting a second-hand one, because they all seem to have the exact same problem. This compressor here, I pulled off my other Camaro years ago when I got my first 305 86 Camaro, and this has been sitting in the basement ever since. Obviously you can see this has the exact same problem as the one that's on the car now. So what I decided to do was go on eBay, pick up the tool to remove the clutch, as well as a rebuild kit with the seals. And as for basement compressor, that thing's not going to be compressing shit. So obviously before we cut this thing open, we're going to need to get it off the car. Just held in place with a few bolts holding it to the adjustment brackets. Then you just pull the hoses off, electrical connector, then just slide the thing forward, get the belt off, and it comes right out. Now first step in pulling this thing apart is going to be removing the clutch, and that's going to be held on there with one nut. With that out of the way, we could get our special tool in here. It's actually going to remove the clutch from the pulley. So with the clutch removed, we're ready to come in here with our special tool and get the pulley itself off. To do this, we're first going to have to remove this snap ring that sits right in the bottom of the actual pulley. With that removed, we can get our tool around here, and you can see the little cup that kind of sits right inside of the inside of the pulley. With that in there, the tool kind of presses against that, clamps on the outside, and pulls the thing clean off. But with the pulley removed, taking a closer look at this thing, you can really just see the sludge on the outside, and it looks like it's just been leaking for years. But the next step to get cracked into this thing is to remove the outer shell. I'm just prying up on this little tab here that keeps the thing in place. With that out of the way, we'll be able to come in here and press the shell off the actual compressor. To do this, this is where I sacrificed that old compressor. I pretty much just cut the thing in half, took the outer shell, and pretty much sit it right on the lip of the compressor we're rebuilding. So over at the press, you can see this thing fits perfectly on top of the compressor we're rebuilding. All I had to do was come in here and cut some notches in the bottom, because there are some kind of tabs on the sides that the thing isn't going to sit perfectly flat on the other compressor. But with that in place and a little press action, that thing popped right off. But with the seal broken, we can easily come in here, separate the compressor from the housing, and gain access to those giant seals that are causing all of our leaks. While I'm in here, we're also going to replace the front seal behind the pulley, as well as the O-ring that seals up the front cover. But with that being said, next step is to remove that front cover. Just coming in here with an impact gun, removing these 4 bolts. That'll allow us to remove that cover and gain access to the seal that's behind it. But with that piece removed, the compressor, we can get in here and remove the snap ring that is sitting against the front shaft seal. But with the clip removed, you're free to give the seal a little bit of persuasion from the back and then pry it out from the front. But with that out of there, there's also an O-ring deep down in there that this kit comes with, and we are going to be replacing it. So once again, with your pick, just get in there nice and deep, like pry this thing out, and then the new one just slides right back in. But before we go and install that front shaft seal, we do need to reinstall this cover. So using the square cut seal provided with the kit, we're just going to pop that right into place, lube it up, put the cover back on, tighten it down, and then we're going to be ready to replace the main case seals. But yeah, 90-degree pick is going to be your best friend with this one, guys. Easy to just come in here, pull the O-rings off, and with them removed, we're actually going to come in with some Scotch-Brite and get that groove nice and clean. You can see there's quite a bit of rust and corrosion on there, and with any kind of gasket job, you want to make sure you get that surface as clean as possible before installing the new parts. But after everything's cleaned up, we're ready to pop our new O-rings on, as well as the case shell. I did the same exact thing with the case as I did with the compressor, just a little Scotch-Brite, kind of polished it up, made sure there was no corrosion in there that would cause a seal problem. And with that done, we can just slip this right over top after applying some lube, bring it back over to the press, and pop it right back into place. Now with the case reassembled, we're ready to install the final seal, which is the one for the front shaft. Now the kit comes with this little tool to install it, and this is just going to prevent it from being damaged while sliding it over the shaft. So the first thing you want to do is slide this thing along the tool with some oil. This is just going to stretch it out and make it go in a little bit easier. But with that done, we can just pop the tool onto the shaft and then proceed to slide the seal over it until it's fully bottomed out. Now to get this thing all the way down, I came in with a socket afterwards and just kind of gave it a few taps to make sure it was bottomed out. And then the last step before we put the pulley back on is to reinstall that snap ring that keeps the seal in place. Now last few steps here are to reinstall the pulley and the clutch. Now when you're installing this, you want to make sure you have the electrical connectors in the correct spot, because depending on where you put them, when you actually put on the car, the plug might end up underneath the compressor or to the side and the wires aren't going to reach. So just make sure you keep note of that while you're actually pressing this thing back on. So I'm missing some footage where I actually pressed the pulley back on, but with that down, we're ready to just put the snap ring back on. Now I want to mention, you do not need a shop press to do this. The tool used to remove the pulley is a hand tool. The tool used to remove the clutch can also be used to reinstall it. And for actually splitting the case from the compressor and, separating it where those O-rings seal around, you can do the same thing I did and kind of make your custom tool, but instead of using a press, just use a hammer and bash it, and it should separate relatively easily. But with that being said, I do have my high-end $99 Harbor Freight press, so I am going to use it. But the last step here is to get that clutch pressed back onto the pulley. Now you want to keep note of the gap here. You don't want to press this thing fully all the way down, because then the compressor is just going to be engaged all the time. So keep a note of the space there. I'm just using a feeler gauge to come in there and measure that air gap. And the gap is a little bit too large here, so we're just going to put the nut back on the clutch and tighten it down. That's going to pull the clutch closer to the pulley and tighten that space up a little bit. With our compressor resealed, we're ready to pop the brackets back on and get this thing back on the car. So before we go charging this thing up, I did forget about one little seal, and that is the one for the high pressure sensor. So to remove this, it's just one snap ring, and then you can pull the whole sensor assembly out. The O-ring itself is actually inside the housing, so you just get in there once again with your 90-degree pick, pull it out, pop the new one in, then the sensor can easily just slide back in. So with all the leaks taken care of, I decided to bring the car back over to the house. The garage heats up really quickly with the engine running inside, so I figured we'd be better off just working in the driveway. I also took a ride down to Harbor Freight and picked up a new set of manifold gauges just to get us the most accurate charge possible. So once again, we're ready to kick on the vacuum pump, open up the valves. We're going to let this thing sit and see if we can actually get full vacuum out of it. So after letting this vacuum down for about an hour, and you can see we are sitting right at 30 inches of mercury, which tells us that the compressor seals were the issue and our leak, at least from the compressor, has been repaired. So after turning the vacuum pump off, you're going to want to let this sit for at least a half hour. Walk away, come back, make sure that needle hasn't moved from where you last saw it. If it kind of dropped down to 20 or even maybe 25, that's going to indicate that there's a leak in the system, and you're going to have to get that fixed before we go and charge it up. But lucky for me, it looks like the compressor seals did the job. So for the next step, we're going to remove the yellow hose from the vacuum pump, and this is what we're going to use to charge the system up. Now you want to use Ester oil because it's compatible with both R12 and R134A. So if you do a conversion like this, it's best to have the oil that's kind of compatible with both. Being the whole system is kind of going to be a mixture of components from both refrigerants. Now if you're using these cans like I am, you're going to want 2 of them. This takes about 6 ounces of oil. Each of these cans are 3 ounces. So to get the oil flowing here, we're just going to turn the fitting on the can down, then back it off. That's going to pierce it and allow the oil to flow through the hose. Now before we open up the low side to let the oil in, just go ahead and give the little Schrader valve a tap there. That's going to get the air out of the line and make sure we're not going to put any of that into the actual AC system. But with that done, we could crack open the low side, flip the can over, and just kind of shake it around and let the oil get sucked in. Now you're not going to be able to empty this entire can until we actually add refrigerant and get the compressor running, but just shake it around and get some of it in there just so the system isn't completely dry when we actually go to charge it. But after shaking this around for a few seconds, take a look at the sight glass on the manifold, and you could tell that the oil kind of just sitting in there, it's not really moving. So we're going to have to add the rest of this once we actually charge the system and get the compressor working. But for now, we have some in there, so we know we're not going to be starting this up completely dry. But now we can close our low side valve, remove the oil can, and we're ready to start adding refrigerant. Alright guys, here we go. We're finally ready to charge this thing up. I'm just moving the fitting over to our refrigerant can, hooking up our hose, then running the valve in and out to pierce the top. And with the refrigerant in the line, just like we did with the oil, we want to blip that Schrader valve to remove any air. So here we are, the home stretch. We are just about ready to put refrigerant into this thing. Now if you come over here by the blower motor housing, you can see the spec for the AC. The original R12 charge took 2.25 pounds. The R134A uses a little bit less, so we're going to be adding 1.8 pounds. But with our refrigerant can pierced, we're ready to start up the car, turn on the AC, and charge this thing up. So with the engine running and the AC on, the compressor obviously is not going to run until we get the refrigerant flowing through the lines. So now we're just going to make sure that the high side is closed, and we're going to crack open the low. All the charging is being done through the low side. You want to make sure you leave that high side closed. But looking at the sight glass there, you can see we have good refrigerant flow. So now we're just going to flip the can over, rock it back and forth, and wait for the compressor to turn on. Once the pressure switch detects the raise in pressure, it's going to kick the clutch on, and we're finally going to start making some cold air. Now at first the compressor is going to cycle really quickly. It's not going to actually stay on longer until we get the full amount of refrigerant in there. But to get to the 28 to 30 ounces we need, it's going to take about 2.5 of these cans. So if you're using the same exact ones as me, just put in 2 full cans, just kind of estimate it and then put another half a can. Now if you want to get this charge perfect to the T, you could go and measure it with a little scale and charge according to that. For me, I'm just adding 2.5 cans, kind of roughing it. We do have the manifold gauges, so we are going to be able to tell what the system is doing, if it's too low or if it's too high. But after you're done adding your 2.5 cans of refrigerant, you're going to want to close the low side, as well as turn down the valve in the can, sealing it shut. With the system fully charged, let's take a look at our gauges here. You can see we have our low side sitting around 30. Once we rev it up, it starts to drop down, and the high side goes up to about 250 before the compressor kicks off. Now I'm going to include a couple of links to some charts in the description below, just so you guys can go and troubleshoot this in case you're getting weird gauge readings and your AC isn't actually cooling. But these are pretty normal for the temperature. When I was recording this, it was 86 degrees outside with 75% humidity. Now, just a couple of quick obvious troubleshooting tips. If you're looking at these gauges, compressor's running and the needles are just staying in the exact same spot, you're getting equal pressure readings on both sides, then your compressor is most likely bad and you're going to have to replace it. The other thing is, if your high side is just trailing off past 300 and it keeps getting hotter and hotter and hotter, take a look at your cooling fan, because those should come on when you turn the air conditioning on, and if they're not running, the condenser isn't getting cool and you're not going to get cold air. But gauge readings aside, if you're wondering if your car's AC isn't working correctly and it could possibly be a problem with the charge, really easy way to check is just come in here, feel your accumulator or feel the low side line with the AC running. You can see here it's kind of sweating and it should feel very cold to the touch if the AC is doing its job. If it does and you're still getting hot air out of the vents, chances are you have a blend door problem. And finally, for vent temps, we're sitting at around 48 degrees. Now keep in mind, we're still using the original R12 tube and vent condenser. If we upgrade to a parallel flow, it is going to cool substantially better. But to be in the 40s and to be over 30 degrees cooler than ambient temperature, the AC is working as it should. It's just not going to be as cold as a modern car unless we do that update and get the better condenser designed for the R134A in there. Now there are a couple of ways you can go about getting a parallel flow condenser. You can modify a 4th gen one to work. You're going to have to weld on your own fittings to get them to fit with the 3rd gen stuff. Or there is a company that makes one, but it's kind of expensive. I think it's 300 bucks. I'm going to find it and link it down in the description if you guys are interested. But the reason I didn't go for that condenser right now is because I'm still using the old compressor, and I know I'm going to do something later on with the engine, and I'm probably going to upgrade the compressor, and I don't want to buy this $300 condenser, and then if this old compressor goes out, I'm not going to be able to flush it, and I basically just threw 300 bucks down the drain. Alright guys, and just like that, we finally have good working AC in his 33-year-old Trans Am. And of course, if you're looking to get the AC working in your 3rd gen, just check down in the description. I'm going to have all the parts I use in this video today, as well as a link to the parallel flow condenser that's going to work better with that R134A refrigerant, just in case you want to go and take that extra step so you can take full advantage of the refrigerant conversion. But before I close this video out, I do want to mention we are going to be changing the format on these videos. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on this car, and I'm just not pumping these videos out fast enough. I have full interior ready to go in. I have T-top seals. I have some engine parts. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done, and by doing this kind of voiceover format, it takes time with filming Tahoe videos, filming Camaro videos. So as for the next video, we are finally going to be replacing those T-top seals. I know a lot of you guys have been patiently waiting for me to make that video, but that is going to be the next one coming out. Then we're going to be replacing the interior and finally cleaning that up. But for now, that is going to do it for this one, guys. So remember, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.